Hi, my Brit. When Jim came back, he brought with him a list of questions that people in your group really wanted to ask me, but couldn't because of how the Skype just didn't work well. Ah, well. Anyway, I made a list of them and looked through them, and I've got the topics that people wanted to discuss with me. So I'll uh, I'll make a video and see if I can satisfy the task. Okay. Now before I start though, I really just want to set the scene yet again, like I did in the first video, I think. There I emphasized our what I call spontaneous responsiveness, and saying things like when it comes to computers doing information processing to work out what's going on a dimension from computers to plants, we're much nearer plants than computers. We just act spontaneously in many situations. This was brought home to me when I did my child development work. I think I mentioned in one of the little videos a little phrase from Vygotsky that grabbed me very early on. And it simply went, Vygotsky saying, one of the first laws of development is what later we can learn to do consciously and deliberately. We first do spontaneously and unconsciously. We just act in that kind of way in an immediate and straightforward way. It's a part of our quite natural responses. In fact, Vygotsky makes that distinction between our lower sort of biological responses, as if we're just living animals, and our higher mental capacities, which are built up in us later. We're born animals, we're born, so to speak, natural living beings, and our humanness is something that the particular way of being human is something that we gradually acquire. We don't inherit it like blue eyes. We inherit it after birth by being immersed in a particular language culture. And in fact, of course, it's one of the first sort of principles of human development that a human baby can, by growing up in different cultures, become a little Eskimo, become a little Native American, become a New Yorker, become a Bostonian, become a Liverpudlian who talks like Ringo Starr, you know. Okay, so we grow up in these different sort of human settings, but we do it because there's an enormous amount of communication going on before we are sort of fully conscious and deliberate and able to talk in a deliberate fashion about this, that, or some other topic. Okay, so that's the little bit of scene setting I want to do first. Let me just start with a question somebody asked, which was, what is it that makes a dialogue a useful dialogue? Or a life-changing dialogue, or we could even say a therapeutic dialogue. Let's just stick with the idea of a life-changing dialogue. Now, one of our basic troubles is that we think that the only really effective way to do anything is to base it on scientific findings. We're so hung up with being intellectual. Is that Descartes' thing of I think, therefore I am? And it's almost as if all of our proper actions have got to be thought about first. Whereas if we really are like animals and plants and we really just spontaneously respond to circumstances as best we can, that's where we're going to have to start. And again, I could bring here a little bit from Jaakko about this continual business of bringing words to experiences that don't yet have words. And besides sort of spontaneous responsiveness, I think again I mentioned in the little videos this business of noticing. And here's a quote from an article written by Jaakko and David Trimble. And the title of the article actually is Healing Elements of Therapeutic Conversation, Dialogue as an Embodiment of Love. It's in Family Process in 2005. And they say that certain experiences have come to mark for us turning points in the healing process. The feelings of love that emerge in us during a network meeting are neither romantic nor erotic. They're just our own embodied responses to participation in a shared world of meaning, co-created with people who trust each other and ourselves to be transparent, comprehensive beings with each other. Well, I think actually I can add a little bit to that. When I was doing the child development work, I drew from a German, again, dialogical philosopher called Max Scheler. And way back in the 1920s, but it was translated into English in 1952, is a book called The Nature of Sympathy. And there's a little bit in the introduction to that book, which I used to sort of use over and over again. And it goes like this. If we love any human being, we certainly love him or her for what he or she is. But at the same time, we love them also for what they might be, according to the possibilities of perfection inherent in their being. Our eyes are fixed upon his ideal image, which we grasp in and through and behind his empirical traits. Yet we're indifferent as to how far it's reflected and realized in his actual state. At the same time, our love is the most potent force that can lift them from one to the other state. It carries before them their own purified and, as it were, redeemed and transfigured likeness. It's as if it's a voice calling to them, become in reality what I can see incipient in you already in those small hints. And that's the point of seeing in those small hints of possibility. Michael White calls them sparkling moments. When I was working with Arlene Katz in the medical sphere, we simply call them struck-bys, just moments that for some reason grabbed you. I mentioned that business from Tom Anderson of just noticing for certain people, certain words are ones that they say with a lot of emotion. This noticing of small beginnings and paying attention to them and responding back to the person with them is a very important activity in making a dialogue a life-changing dialogue. Somebody asked about giving and receiving respect. Well, the task really is to get a sense of what respect in different situations looks like, feels like, sounds like, and so on. Um, uh, I think when you're on the receiving end of it, uh, you can notice it. And again, I think in one of the little videos, I used a quotation from William James where he talked about the flow of speech uh, giving rise into those who are recipients of it. He said, feelings of tendency, but there is a movement of feeling in us, which is so vague that we cannot give it any name at all, but of which we have an acute discriminative awareness. And when you're on the receiving end of people's expressions, you can usually tell. Uh, you can certainly tell when they ask you a question. You can certainly tell when they make a demand on you, give you an order. Can you do this? Will you do that for me, please, etc. You can tell when they're being angry or unfriendly. You can even tell when they're being attentive to you. You go to a party and start talking to somebody, and then you see them looking over your shoulder, and you feel insulted. So when you're on the receiving end, uh, it's it's quite easy to get a sense of how that person is relating to you. And I don't know how many of you have had the experience, but on just some occasions, I have had talking to people. People have a little weep and actually say, I've never experienced anybody listening in such a sort of attentive way to me and taking seriously what I said. When you're on the receiving end, those kinds of feelings are fairly easy to recognize. They're much more difficult to recognize when you're on the doing side of things. There's a little saying of Foucault's, which I quite like, where he says, most of the time we know what we're doing and why we're doing it, but what we don't know is what our doing is doing. How can we get a sense of how our way of relating to another person is touching them, how it's making them feel? And the only thing I can think of there is to continually be saying to yourself, how would I like to be talked to in this way? How would I like somebody to address me in that tone of voice? How would you like it if somebody was talking to your child in that kind of way, and so forth? Um, it's setting yourself little inner exercises like that where you role play somebody talking in a very authoritarian tone to you and saying, do this, please, rather than, I mean, a little phrase I often use to just point out what you might call a factual way of talking, or an enticing, dramatic way of talking is simply to say, the cat sat on the mat was red, the cat was black. There, get the picture. Or I could say, the cat sat on the mat was red, the cat was black. am I telling a ghost story? Am I telling of a murder or what? When I say it in the second way, it arouses anticipations of what's coming next. And all utterances that are properly communicative, open utterances, part of an open dialogue, that openness always arouses the possibility of a next step of somebody responding. So another question was somebody saying, how do we teach ourselves to accept that other people might be right? Well, my own feeling is that when it comes to open dialogue, uh, again, one thing that Jaco emphasizes is what Bakhtin calls polyphony, many different voices. And uh, Bakhtin talks about a dialogical truth as being a unity of unmerged voices. Uh, and he was extremely interested in Dostoevsky's way of writing because he was saying Dostoevsky did not himself have a single point of view. He communicated the complexity of Russian society at the time he was writing by putting in all the different views, or all the views which seemingly contradicted each other. Well, they only contradicted each other if you think the world is a fundamentally orderly and logical place. But the human world is not an orderly and logical place. Everybody has their own point of view, their own interests. They pick out the bits that are interesting to them and ignore the other bits, and you do likewise. And you each have different views. And the point is, no one of them is correct. I had a little involvement when I was in America in what's called the Public Conversations Project, who were trying to take out all the violent antagonism that was going on between the pro-life and the pro-choice people who were actually killing each other. And they managed to establish quite a long dialogue. You can look it up or ask me, and I'll send you the Boston Globe article. But the overall outcome of it was that the people involved, the three priests on each side of the debate, saying by the end of the dialogue, we hadn't changed our views, but we had come to respect the reasons for those on the other side from us, for holding their different views from us. So we were more than happy to work with them, even though they had different views than us, of how to cooperate, take out all the push button words, the violent words, the fighting words, and take the violence out of the situation and create a situation where much more nuanced and much more detailed and much more interesting to both of us, rather than just shouting at our enemies. Somebody else was asking about improvisation and the unexpected and possibly making mistakes. Well, what I was trying to suggest a moment ago. There's no one right way of doing anything. Uh, uh, we may think there's a homogeneous therapeutic practice, but there's many different roads to Mecca. People achieve similar results in many different ways. There's no one right way of who knows the perfect way. Uh, Even when they talk about evidence-based practices, uh, it's been decided beforehand what the evidence is, what the criterion of success is. Fewest treatments, cheapest treatments, all the clients putting down 7 out of 7 on a rating scale or something, going off medication for 5 years. What is the criterion of best? So Jaco has one of his principles is tolerance of uncertainty, and but I've always not quite argued with him, but I've suggested to him actually a celebration of uncertainty. Those moments of bewilderment where you don't know a next step to take are moments. The old Chinese thing of those moments of crisis are moments of danger and opportunity. They're the moments when something else can be done. And rather than thinking about it as a mistake, think about it as something to which somebody else, rather than just being bewildered, will give a response to. And all of a sudden, you're off in a new direction. There's a terrific innovation. The classic case here is Miles Davis with his recording of Shades of Blue. If you look into it, you'll find that he came with a crowd of unprepared musicians, gave them some extremely brief sketches. They were all extremely anxious and afraid and didn't know what to do next. But you could say they made it up as they went along. And it's now thought of as one of the great innovative jazz tracks of all time, of starting off all new ways of doing things in jazz. And of course, in my fifth little video, I remember. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to it, but I made a distinction between researchers and experimentalists, and saying as sort of Jaco is doing a lot of research, trying to, so to speak, prove what are the sort of moments of sort of physiological coordination between people. But people like Jim Wilson, Justine Len Larwick, are being experimentalists and arranging people's ways of relating to events, which give them feelings in events which they wouldn't otherwise feel. So don't think it's a mistake. Think it's a new event to give a new response to. Somebody else was worrying about the only thing that Jim had written down is the difficulty of knowing somebody for a long time. And I presume they mean that quite often you'll meet a client, say, for an hour each week for perhaps a couple of years. And after half of those meetings, uh, there's nothing new going on. At least seemingly, they've said all they're going to say in that situation. But I myself make use of lots of little stories which I take as instructive. One little story from Oliver Sacks meeting a girl on a hospital ward who he was told how brain damaged she was, and um, tried talking with her, and didn't seem to be able to get much out of her. But another day, he saw that girl sitting out on a bench in the hospital grounds, uh, and she was talking to him about the birds and the flowers, and in that setting, she was totally engaged. Very difficult to find anything wrong with her at all. Uh, I remember too working with somebody called Martin Ling, I think his name was, in Gothenburg, and he was working with autistic kids who uh, all sat alone, didn't talk with each other, and so forth. Uh, but then he devised a whole game where they were building medieval forts and so on. And he showed me a videotape of it. And they were all talking with each other, and let me get you that bit that will fit there, and we could build a drawbridge here. Yes, we could. Well, that bit over there will fit, etc., etc. And changing the setting can be very different. Um, you're in a classroom with students. You ask questions, the students are all quiet and so forth. The class is over, and as soon as everybody's out in the corridor, things are different. Uh, so don't just think it's all there in people's heads. People are different people in different settings. And if you want to get something different out of a person who you've grown bored with, take them into a new context, and perhaps some new responses will come out. Yeah, so somebody asked about trust. Well, I tend myself to work in terms of what I call instructive examples, little little vignettes which illustrate something important to me. And the vignette I'm remembering was Tom Anderson consulting in the Boston clinic, Sarianne Roth, and the group of people that she'd had a little bit of trouble with was a family, a single mother with her daughter, uh, and the daughter's friend came along to the session, and the grandmother. And the trouble was uh, that there was a lot of emotion going on among the four of them, to do with the grandmother. She wasn't getting on with any of the others in the family at all. And at the beginning of the session, she walked into the therapy room, looked at the one-way screen, and said to Tom and Sally Ann, "Are there people sitting behind there?" "Yes, they are. They're watching us." "Huh, I'm having nothing to do with this." And she took a chair away from the other three. Tom started, Sally Ann was just being the observer. Tom started talking to the mother and daughter and the daughter's friend. And for 6 or 7 minutes, and there was a lot of anxious laughter and tones of voice among the three girls, but Tom talked with them, and gradually the whole situation became very calm and very orderly. And after those, that 6, 7, 8 minutes, the grandmother said, "The time has come. We've got to talk about it. It's my cancer." What went on there? Somehow that grandmother, just listening to the respectful way and careful way that Tom was talking with the other three, had felt that here at last was a situation where she could say something that she'd not been able to say before. That kind of circumstance where she knew that Tom would listen, take it seriously, would regulate the situation, and have the others listening carefully to her, and so forth. One last little bit of a story. I mean, my wife Cherry, a manager of a secure unit, very disturbed young people between 12 and 18. One of the little 15, 16-year-old girls came to her and said, "Can I speak with you, Cherry?" "Well, of course you can, but Dr. Patel's your psychiatrist. Why don't you speak to her?" "Well, the trouble is, I can't find my words without Dr. Patel." And of course, that's the trouble. Dr. Patel was all just technical with her, was all just asking diagnostic questions and so forth. To hark back to what I said a little bit about being respectful, that capacity just to listen and to be calm and to signal back that you're actually hearing what the person has to say, and trust does emerge in those calm and situation where you exhibit your curiosity about the other person. So, what is it to be human? Well, I suggest on the dimension from computers to plants. Plants go through a life cycle. Plants are always growing and developing. And of course, and dying too. But before they die, producing seeds, producing new plants, and so forth. But there's always that business of, so to speak, being on the developmental edge. There's always a next new step to take. New buds to grow, new leaves to grow, new seeds to produce, etc., etc. So this is the openness of open dialogue. As soon as you try to operate within boundaries, protocols, predefined concepts, and close the openness, you've stopped that living on the edge of where the life is. Where is the life in one's talk? It's those moments, a mistake, you make a mistake. No, you have a moment of bewilderment, but you're in a particular situation when you're bewildered. And you go into that situation. What does the situation require? I was giving a talk once about the sort of openness of conversation, and somebody gave me a tape of how Simon, God, Simon and Garfunkel, Paul Simon. Paul Simon produced that number, Diamonds on the Soles of Her Shoes. It was saying he was having to appear on Saturday Night Live with this whole African group of singers and dancers. They produced an LP and a CD, I mean, and they were going to do one of those numbers, and the record company said, you can't because it's not been released yet. They had to invent a number on the spot, and all Paul Simon had was this riff about she got diamonds on the soles of her shoes. And a couple of the musicians started playing. One just played that riff on a guitar, somebody on a bass guitar answered to it, and all of a sudden the number was off. And the two black musicians, one just said, well, it came out in conversation, but it was a musical conversation. So this living on the edge, improvising, being where the life is, not closing things down. Our humanness is, we're continually growing a little bit more of our humanness, and the whole process, it isn't over yet. Many different ways of being human. Well, there is just one final thing that I think I'll mention. There's the American anthropologist Clifford Geertz. I think he might even be dead now, but writing very usefully in the 1970s and 80s and so on. And he's got a very nice article simply called Common Sense as a Cultural System. And he sets out some properties of common sense. He says, I want to take the words that it's natural, it's practical, it's thin, it's immethodical, it's not orderly like a theory or a model, it's all over the place, but it's accessible to everybody. And he says, but I want to add ness on the end of all of those words, like naturalness, practicalness, thinness, immethodicalness, accessibleness, and so forth. And the first example of naturalness, he actually takes to do with gender and sexuality. And he says, of course, us Americans just think they're a male and female, and that's it. And the whole existence of intersexed people who are neither seem to be one nor the other are unnatural. But then he goes into many other cultures of the world where such intersex people aren't thought to be unnatural. They're thought to be gifted in some way. They're prodigies. It's something perfectly natural that can happen in our sexual reproduction, but such people are special. And of course, that's been sometimes the wise fool, even in the Western cultures. What is it? Chauncey Gardner in the movie, who had something wise to say about everything. I've forgotten the detail now. But this naturalness is different in different circumstances among different people. The next thing he talks about is practicalness, that common sense is very sort of basic. You say to people, be sensible, that won't work. Wake up to the ordinary everyday practicalities of of doing something. Don't think that special measures are always needed. But the one I really like is what he calls thinness. That he's pointing out that technical people like to make everything very complicated. But there's a saying, even before I was reading Chomsky years ago, I knew the saying that hard cases make bad law. And Chomsky said something very similar about grammar, that we learn our grammar from simple sentences. And we devise the rules from the simple sentences. And then once we've devised the rules, we can apply the rules mechanically to more complicated sentences. But you can't derive grammar from complicated sentences. Hard cases make bad law. And that's the idea of this idea of thinness. And then another one I like is immethodicalness. And in that sense, I'm very immethodical. I just gave you that example from Tom Anderson of building trust. That he gives the example. He says, where is it? In many cultures, people talk to each other much more in terms of proverbs. Look before you leap, but he hesitates is lost. A stitch in time saves 9, but seize the day. They're totally inconsistent, but each proverb has its application in a particular situation. And I work myself very much in terms of, if you like, proverbs that notice those small things that seem to mean a lot to people. Notice those big words. Notice those hesitations. Notice those the stumbling that I think I mentioned that when Tom Song's saying to Carl Tom, when you can't find quite the right words and you search for it, your clients become much more engaged with you and so forth. And then the final one, of course, is accessibleness, where you may think that only certain experts can pick up whether other people are lying or other people are insincere or other people are respectful, etc., etc. But it's not. It's ordinary, everyday people know how to recognize authenticity and sincerity when they hear it. It's no wonder that most of us think that politicians never properly avoid answering the question and pulling the wool over our eyes, and we can hear out loud all the time what it is that they're not saying. These are all very basic things to do with having conversations with people and keeping on that living edge and doing open dialogue and not closing things down. Okay, I hope I've gone some way to answering some of your questions. Bye for the moment.